Hello, I want to introduce our next phylum, and this is a biggie, the phylum Arthropoda. And we could talk a lot about the arthropods, and I'll point out to you here several times that this is the most dominant phylum of animals on the planet. The first thing that we want to talk about that sort of sets them off is the cuticle, right? So invertebrates, the outermost layer of our integument is the epidermis. You're familiar with that. In arthropods, they have a rigid cuticle. That's their outermost layer. It's an exoskeleton. And if you'll recall how these organisms are related to other animal phyla that we've talked about, they're still protostomes, and so the mouth forms first, and they're triploblasts. They form 3 germ layers. Remember those general characteristics. And then you'll recall that we mentioned that this group all forms a cuticle that molts. And so as the organism grows, they have to shed this exoskeleton and grow a new one. And that's what unites this clade. Now, we talked about Annelida a couple days ago, and some of the annelids also have a cuticle, but it's thin and they don't have to molt, and so it's like a proto-cuticle, or it's different than the cuticle that you have in the group we're going to study today. You also recall that we talked about the nematoda, or the roundworms, earlier, and that was a big group that has a cuticle that needs to be molted. But today we're talking about Arthropoda, which is an enormous phylum. And so we can talk about the cuticle in a little bit more detail. We've mentioned it in the past a couple of times, and here's a diagram from your book. And again, we want to point out the cuticle is non-living, and so it's not cellular, it's non-cellular. Now it's secreted from a living cell, and so you have a layer of epidermis that secretes this non-living cuticle. And we can break the cuticle down into a couple of layers. Your outer layer is the epicuticle, and your inner layer is the procuticle. And these vary by their composition. And so the epicuticle has mostly protein and lipid in it. And of course, lipids are hydrophobic, and so this protein-lipid layer tends to make it waterproof. The procuticle, which is thicker and it's the middle layer, that's where you're going to find mostly chitin, which, remember, is a structural carbohydrate. And so we talked about chitin before, and also protein. And then this is laid down in layers to make that inner part of the cuticle. And so whenever the organism needs to grow, because this is a hard outer exoskeleton, of course that inhibits them from growing. So they need to molt and shed that exoskeleton, grow, and then toughen up and form a new exoskeleton. And so we can talk about that in just a little bit more detail here. Now, if we can take that procuticle, and it itself can be broken down into a couple layers, the exocuticle and the endocuticle. And of course, endo meaning inside, so the endocuticle is the most inside layer. And so when the animal needs to molt, the old procuticle separates from the epidermis, and it starts to dissolve. And so that creates an empty space between the procuticle and that living layer of cells. And that living layer of cells then starts to secrete a new exocuticle, or excuse me, epicuticle. So the epicuticle is the furthest out layer, the one that's waterproof. And so once that procuticle is released from the epidermis, that gives room for the epidermis to form a whole new epicuticle. Then, as the molting progresses, that procuticle gets dissolved. The epidermal layer releases enzymes which help to dissolve that procuticle, and then much of that gets to be reabsorbed. And so that makes a lot of sense, right? It wouldn't make any sense to just dissolve it and let it slough off. Dissolve it and reabsorb it so you can use it to build your new procuticle. And so as that is happening, that's making more and more space. And so now you've got that thin epicuticle already made. Now you can start to build an exocuticle underneath it. And the difference between the exocuticle and the endocuticle is just the relative composition of chitin and protein and calcium and other things. And so they're made of similar materials. They're just made of different sort of ratios of those. And you know, one's going to be a little tougher than the other. That's all the really difference is. So now we're forming that new exocuticle in the space that's being vacated as we dissolve the old procuticle. And so at some point then, you've got the entire endocuticle has been dissolved and reabsorbed. And so then the old epicuticle and the old exocuticle are shed, and that's ecdysis. And that's when you get rid of that old exoskeleton. And that's fine because you've just completed building your new epicuticle and exocuticle, right? And so then the cuticle is not yet hardened. And so it can stretch and it can grow. And so now the organism can grow. And then as it grows, it can secrete a new endocuticle, that last layer of the procuticle. And then it can harden the cuticle, and now you've got a new cuticle, a new exoskeleton. So that's just a little bit more detail in how this cuticle is molted. And so the cuticle can vary in hardness and flexibility. And so, for example, some of the arthropods, add calcium carbonate, which makes a very hard exoskeleton. It makes a very hard cuticle, right? So you're looking at things like lobsters and crabs, and you're familiar with how hard their shell is, right? If you ever eaten lobster and you have to get a special tool to like crack it open. And that's because it's got rock in there. It's got calcium carbonate. Others have a different way to harden the cuticle called sclerotization. And so that's this protein called sclerotin that is released. And remember that the procuticle is formed in layers, and so the sclerotin sort of cross-links between those layers, and that's another way that you can harden it up. But in insects, you know, the cuticle is a little bit more flexible. It's not as hard as in things like lobsters and crabs. And so why do we talk about the cuticle so much when we talk about arthropods? Well, this was a major evolutionary advancement. This really allowed them to explode as an animal phylum. And again, you can think of it as a suit of armor. And so if you think of a suit of armor, it's very tough, but it's got joints where it needs to have joints so you can be mobile. But this suit of armor, this cuticle, is very light too. And so it's got a lot of advantage. And so having this hard exoskeleton is good, of course, for protection. That waterproof layer helps to stop dehydration. The joints are flexible like a suit of armor, and so even though you've got protection, you still have mobility. Just like an endoskeleton, an advantage of a skeleton is it's an attachment point for muscles. And so now you've got all kinds of new attachment points for muscles, and they're designed in such a way that they can act as levers. And so all of these together really helped the arthropods develop many different ways of movement. And so they can develop rapid forms of movement and even flight. And so these are the only invertebrates that can fly. And that is due to this evolution of the cuticle. And I haven't mentioned it already, but Arthropoda means jointed foot. And so that's sort of one of the things. We talk about this suit of armor, and it's got joints in it. And so you can look at the cuticle when you observe any arthropod, and you can see that it's got hinges or joints. And so that's where it kind of gets the name jointed foot. And, you know, I can't emphasize enough how important the arthropods are to the animal kingdom. They're the most numerous phylum of animals on Earth. Something like 3/4 of all animal species are in this phylum. Something like 1.1 million species have been described, and there's probably at least that many that we still haven't discovered yet, we haven't described yet. They're everywhere, they do everything. And so they're a very important phylum. Where do you find them? Well, where do they live? Everywhere. What do they eat? Everything. For the most part, you know, I would say they're probably mostly herbivores, but they really do. You're going to find herbivory and omnivory and carnivory throughout the phylum. And so what kind of animals are we talking? Well, lots of things with which you are familiar. Spiders, scorpions, centipedes, insects. And so we'll give examples of all these here in a second. But again, I just need to emphasize how vast and important and interesting this phylum is. And I also would like to point out that given its relative importance and given how common they are, because we're endotherms and hemiotherms and vertebrates, we have a bias toward those. And so in lots of biology programs, you do spend a lot more time talking about the vertebrates, and we probably know more about the vertebrates. And that's, that's understandable because that's what we are. But there's probably a little bit, not probably, there is a bias against this phylum, and there shouldn't be. And if we really want to have a complete understanding of the animal kingdom, we really need to understand the arthropods, and we study them a lot more than we actually do. So hopefully we're trying to recognize that and trying to rectify that. Anyway, here's a general phylogeny of this phylum. And so we kind of break it down into 4 subphyla: Chelicerata, Myriapoda, Crustacea, and Insecta, or excuse me, Hexapoda. There's also sometimes in these they include a 5th phylum, the Trilobita, I think. So if you've ever seen fossil trilobites, they're a very common fossil, and that is sometimes considered an extinct subphylum of the arthropods. So one way that we determine these clades within this cladogram is by looking at the mouth parts. And so we have kind of 2 basic types of mouth parts: chelicerae, and mandibles. And so you can see examples of these here. Now, one thing that's interesting about this phylum that sets it apart from others is their mouth parts chew vertically, right? Which is the exact opposite. Your mouth parts chew horizontally; these chew vertically, and you can see how they're designed, or how that works in both of these type of mouth parts. But the chelicerae are what spiders and arachnids have, and the rest of them have these mandibles. And so that's where we get, so the evolution of mandibles is shared by these subphyla. Let me get my pen out here. Here's my pen, and so yeah. So you've got these subphyla, which have the shared derived characteristic of the mandible. And the chelicerae are shared by those in the Chelicerata. And so, from the name of the subphylum, you can sometimes figure out characteristics of the subphylum, right? Okay, so in this first subphylum, you've got spiders, scorpions, daddy longlegs, ticks, mites, and horseshoe crabs. So let's just talk about them just very briefly. Again, we're taking the 10,000-foot view here. We are just touching upon the organisms in this phylum. We literally have entire semester-long classes dedicated just to entomology, just to the arthropoda. Actually, just to insects would be entomology. And so we cannot get into deep detail into any of these. And so we're just kind of trying to get an overview for the purposes of our class. And so again, within the subphylum, you've got horseshoe crabs. And looking at a horseshoe crab, you would not think that this is related to things like spiders, right? But you look at some characteristics like the chelicerae, and also the 4 pairs of walking legs. So they have 8 legs like a spider. And so things like that are what help you realize that they are related more closely to the spiders than to the other arthropods. And spiders are fascinating, and we have this Again, we are sort of taught to be afraid and jumpy around spiders, but there's no reason. There's very few spiders that are dangerous to us, right? You know, we've got over here, you've got the black widow spider and the brown recluse, right? Which we do have here in Kentucky. And of course, you know, their bites can be painful and dangerous and rarely, but occasionally fatal. But I mean, they're not common, and if you're careful and you know where to look for them, this is not anything to be afraid of. But the majority of spiders are not dangerous to humans, and we really shouldn't be afraid of them. And in fact, they're, you know, they're our buddies, right? They're eating a lot of these other insects that bother us. But they're fascinating, just a fascinating group. One of the more fascinating things about them, of course, is that they can build these webs and the different kinds of webs, and they use webs for all kinds of different things. And you've got spiders that, you know, like will dangle their web and like go fishing for other organisms and build these intricate webs and use webs to help them, you know, float around. And so that's another fascinating aspect of the spiders. And another interesting fact is that one of the components of the web is a scleroprotein. So you remember that we talked about sclerotin, which is a way to harden the cuticle. And so similar proteins are used to make spider silk. And spider silk is very strong, and it's because of this, you know, this type of protein. So you got, again, it's an evolutionary, something that evolved in this group that was very advantageous to them. All right, also in the same class as the spiders and the scorpions are you know, harvestmen, or daddy longlegs is what I grew up calling them. And they've got, again, similar mouth parts and 8 legs, but these are not technically spiders. They're in the same class, but they're kind of their own order. Ticks and mites are also going to be here. And these, of course, are very important to humans. They're second probably only mosquitoes as vectors of disease. And so that's something that we humans have to be concerned about. There's an interesting mite that lives in the pores of your face. And so your face, you've got all these mites and things living in there, whether you like it or not. And they eat dead skin cells. So it's a good thing. It helps to clean up, you know, your dead skin cells off of your face. Sometimes you can take a glass slide and just rub it on your face and then put it under a compound scope to see these. They're, of course, very small. But think about that tonight when you're falling asleep. Think about all the things that come crawling out on your face. Okay, the next subphylum that we want to briefly mention here are the Myriapoda, centipedes and millipedes. And so again, from the name, you can sort of infer characteristics: myria or myriad, many, poda, feet. So this is the group that's got many feet. And so, of course, your centipedes only have 1 pair of legs per segment, but obviously this is a unique characteristic. The millipedes have 2 pairs of legs per segment. And so something like this millipede you're looking at here, you might want to ask yourself, or I might ask you, well, how are these different from earthworms? They're segmented, they're worm-like. How come these are not in the Annelida? And of course, you already know one answer, right? Arthropoda, they've got a hard cuticle that must be molted. And so that's a characteristic of the millipedes. You know, also different mouth parts, different respiratory type organs, things like that. So superficially, these look a little bit like the earthworms. Of course, the earthworms don't have the pairs of legs per segment. So those are some of the clues that tell you that this is an arthropod, not an annelid. Okay, the last 2 subphyla here are huge, and these are where most of your arthropods are found. These contain most arthropod species, and you're familiar with lots of the organisms in these 2 subphyla. Huge numbers of species found everywhere, just completely so important to ecosystems, any type of ecosystem. And so we've got the crustaceans and the hexapods. The hexapods are mostly insects. And so you can think of these, one big difference here is the crustaceans dominate aquatic environments. They're like aquatic insects. And then, of course, the hexapoda, which are mostly insects dominate the terrestrial environment. And so you've got these two groups that have evolved in different environments, but they've come to dominate those environments by sheer numbers of species and biomass and importance. There's just no question that these are very important organisms. So of course in your crustaceans you've got many things with which you're familiar with: lobsters, crabs, crayfish, but there's lots of others too. And so here's your standard large crustacean. We're going to dissect some crayfish in lab. Again, you're familiar with sort of the overall morphology of these. If you've ever eaten a lobster, remember that we said that this group adds calcium carbonate to their cuticle, and so this is why they make a very hard cuticle. And so if you've ever ripped open a lobster, you know how hard that exoskeleton is. Of course, they have very large muscles in the tail area that makes them swim backward very quickly, but that's of course very tasty, and that's the part that we eat. Of course, on a crawfish you can also rip that off and suck all the guts out of the cephalothorax too. Crabs, same way. If you ever had crab legs, you know you have to have a big tool to break open the crab leg to get to that nice sweet muscle that's inside, and that's because they use rock. They use calcium carbonate to harden the cuticle. So you're familiar with a lot of these larger crustaceans, and most of these are in the Decapoda, Decapods. They've got 10 pairs of appendages. Here's a cool example of a crab using a sponge as camouflage. Almost like it's wearing a sponge toupee, but again, if you study any arthropod group, you're going to find really interesting behaviors. But other crustaceans that are really important that you might not be as familiar with are microscopic. They're small, they're large enough that you can see them with the naked eye. If you held up a jar of pond water, you could see them swimming around, but to really see the details, you need at least a dissecting microscope. And these are major components of what we call zooplankton. Plankton are small aquatic organisms that can't really swim against a current so much. And you've got the phytoplankton, which are small photosynthetic organisms that are the base of the aquatic food web, and you've got the zooplankton, which are the small animals that eat the phytoplankton, and they're very important as food to larger vertebrates and other organisms within the aquatic environment. They're down there at the base of the food web. And a large component of the zooplankton are these different microscopic crustaceans. So these are some that you might not be as familiar with. And if we have time, we'll look at some of these in lab. So ostracods are very common. We did see some Daphnia. You'll recall that we fed some Daphnia to some hydra in an earlier lab. Those are aquatic crustaceans. They're very important to the zooplankton, an important component of the zooplankton. Copepods, sheer biomass. This may be the largest biomass of all the arthropods, potentially, when you figure that they live in the oceans and the fresh water. And again, aquatic crustaceans that are important to the base of the aquatic food web. Some crustaceans act as parasites of vertebrates, and so we had some earlier non-crustacean arthropods, the ticks and the mites, which are common vertebrate parasites, which also has some of these crustaceans. Here's an example of ARGULUS, which is fish lice. And so the picture down here in the lower left is the ventral surface of a fish, and you can see the ARGULUS that attach to them. Sometimes people confuse these, but another group of crustaceans are the amphipods. Amphipods being several types of foot. And so that's what one thing that makes these different is that they've got all these different appendages, but they have different appendages, you know, some for feeding, some for walking. And so these are not the same group. Also, whereas the isopod is dorsoventrally compressed, these are laterally compressed. And so these are compressed from the sides, not top to bottom, whereas the isopod is flattened top to bottom. So these are like freshwater shrimp, scuds. So if you're a fly fisherman, you're familiar with these. You're familiar with a lot of the arthropods because you're trying to mimic the arthropods because that's what the fish are eating. And scud is a typical fly pattern, and those are what are found in the amphipod. Another interesting type of crustacean, the barnacle, these are sessile. So these don't move. They attach to ships, or they attach to whales, or they attach to things and just sit there. And at first glance, you might think it'd be something like a coral or some of these other more sessile animals that we've looked at. But no, they're a crustacean. Okay, the final group, again, that you're very familiar with, that is just dominates the terrestrial environment, are the insects, the hexapoda. And so hexapoda, 6 legs, and so these have 6 pairs of walking legs. And so technically all the hexapoda are not insects. You've got a few groups here that are not technically insects, but the majority of the organisms in this group are insects. And you probably recognize individuals from many of these groups, right? You've got you know, dragonflies, and you've got mayflies, and of course we looked at grasshoppers the other day, and beetles, and then butterflies. And so, you know, you're familiar with a lot of the insects, and of course insects are just so numerous, and we could spend a whole semester talking about them. There's incredible diversity in the insect world, in the species and the structures, such as these antennae. And you see all kinds of different antennae, different use for the antennae. And you've got diversity in the legs and the appendages. And so you see you've got this bee that's got all these different structures on its legs, you know, that do different things for either packing pollen or brushing pollen. Or you've got the big legs of the grasshopper that are used for jumping, and the other legs that are used for walking. And so lots of variability in there. Again, this is another reason why the arthropods are so successful. It's because they got all these structures upon which natural selection can act, and that can be modified for any different, you know, based upon the environment. You've got lots of variability in the wings, right? You know, you've got these really hard you know, wings that form like a capsule in beetles. You've got walking sticks that don't have wings. You've got 1 pair of wings or 2 pair of wings, and different shaped wings, and wings that move in different ways. And, so lots of variability there, lots of things for natural selection to act upon. Lots of variability in the mouth parts, and we looked at some mouth parts in the grasshopper and all these different. We talked about how the mouth parts differentiate these groups from the spiders and things, but then you've got mouth parts that are made for, you know, feeding on nectar way down deep into in a flower, and you've got sucking mouth parts, and so again, lots of variability in the insect. You've got lots of different defense mechanisms. Again, extreme variability here. And so you've got, you know, extreme examples of camouflage that you see in this top picture. And then you've got really cool, interesting things like mimicry, right? Where you've got one species that, the monarch, that is toxic because it feeds on these plants that have toxic compounds. And so, you know, the birds and other predators learn to avoid anything that looks like a monarch. And so then you have like the viceroy, which mimics the monarch. Now the viceroy isn't toxic, and so, but the birds don't know that. The bird looks at this and thinks, oh wow, that's one of those toxic butterflies, and so that's a type of mimicry. However, the viceroy sometimes, depending upon what it eats, can be toxic, and so now you've got these two toxic butterflies, but they mimic one another. And again, that's so it keeps it simple for the predator. The predator doesn't have to learn all these different colorations that are toxic. It only has to learn one thing that's toxic. And anyway, it's a fascinating defense mechanism. Or you've got just incredible diversity in behavior in the insects, right? You've got dung beetles that roll these big balls of dung and then lay their eggs in them. You've got lightning bugs that flash to try to attract mates, but then you've got, I think this lightning bug here, tricked. You know, it flashed a pattern from a different species, tricked the male to come in, not to mate with it, but so it could eat it. Of course, you know, bees have incredible social behavior and can divide labor and can teach each other's where to find nectar based upon a dance. And again, you've got ants that have different, you know, that can divide labor, and you've got other ants that can have a mutual relationship with these thrips or some other kind of insect here, where the ant is provided with food and it protects these other organisms, and there's just no end. And you can talk about the mating behavior and the dancing and all kinds of cool things. Bottom line is, you know, if I haven't said it 100 times already, is that the arthropods are incredibly diverse, incredibly interesting, and incredibly important. And there's lots of insects that benefit humans, and so they eat other insects that are pests, and so you've got lots of insect pests, but they get controlled by these other beneficial insects. And so it is an amazing phylum, and we don't give it enough credit sometimes in zoology, but that's what I'm trying to rectify here. If you want to be employed for life, just study arthropod behavior or study arthropods. We don't know, there's so little we know about them. And so there's no end to interesting things to study. So anyway, I think I've made that point. That's really all I have. So let me know if you've got any questions, and I will see you later.